Welcome to the Minimalist Educator Podcast, a podcast about paring down to refocus on the purpose and priorities in our roles, with co-hosts and co-authors of the Minimalist Teacher Book, Tammy Musiowski-Borneman and Christine Arnold.
In this episode, we tackle the challenge of how to sustain our spaces once we've gone through the decluttering process. We talk about why it's so important and what makes it challenging to maintain.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Minimalist Educator Podcast. Today, Christine and I are talking about a topic that comes up as a question quite often at the end of sessions if we're talking about decluttering physical spaces. So we today are going to talk about sustaining a decluttered space. And before we start, how are you today, Christine?
I'm really good. As I mentioned to you before we started recording, I have slight concerns as sustaining these decluttered spaces may not be my forte. It is a tricky one for me, but I know you have a lot of expertise and I have the theoretical idea of what it's all about, but maybe it's a good reminder for me as well about how to keep on with these decluttered spaces.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point that you bring up because we have to be real about no one is going to be 100% decluttered all the time. It's just really hard because life goes on and you let things pile up or whatever happens. And so I think it's important that you're just very honest. We're all honest about, our spaces are not always decluttered consistently. No. It's just not real life.
No, well, maybe for some people, but
right. Maybe not for us, but maybe for some people who are just, it's just really easy for them. And I think that's why it's important we talk about this because it is fairly hard for a lot of people to be able to sustain a space that, you put the effort into decluttering it. Mm-hmm. And that might be in your house, like a closet or a drawer. Or part of your classroom, a cupboard or your office or something. So it doesn't matter what space, but it is a lot of time and energy to spend cleaning it out, sorting it out, organizing it, getting rid of whatever needs to be gotten rid of. Mm-hmm. And then it's a little heartbreaking when you see it start to crumble in front of you.
It is. It definitely is. But there's hope. There is hope for us.
There definitely is. So, I think maybe we can first talk about why it is hard to sustain a decluttered space, because I think that's just part of real life. But can you share a little bit about why it's hard for you?
Yeah, I think the current situation that's making it challenging for me. So as we're recording this, I have a dual role at my school. So I work across 2 classrooms and then I'm also in office working with curriculum. So what happens at the end of my curriculum days is I know I have to do a quick pivot back into the classroom. And then after I'm finished in the classroom, I don't want to leave the materials I've been using in the room for my team teacher. Mm-hmm. But I also want to go home because it's the weekend. So I end up taking the materials from the classroom, putting it in my office and going home. And then when I get back into my curriculum days, I'm now thinking about curriculum and I'm not thinking about the classroom anymore. So I think it's a byproduct of me not quite working out my systems of managing my dual roles. So I think that's what's happening to me at the moment. What about for you? What's making it hard for you?
That's a really good point that you've made about the dual roles, because I know that there's a lot of teachers who do a team teach and are in curriculum or something like that. So I can imagine there's a lot of people who can relate to that. For me, it's kind of a thing that happens in my office. So when we were teaching in Singapore, I decided that I wasn't going to use Post-its anymore because I was writing stuff down and then sticking them in my planner and then losing them and, and so I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do Post-its anymore. I'm just going to have a notebook. So everything's in one spot. And that was fine. But in recent weeks or months, maybe now, I've shifted back to using Post-its because I feel like it's like I'll write one to do per Post-it, and then I kind of like a Kanban, I think it's pronounced Kanban board, where you like sort out your priorities by week. So what I'll do, it's like my own modified version. I'll write all of my things on my Post-its, and then I'll sort them out. Like, these are the things I'm going to do today. And then like, throughout the week. And so when I do the thing, then I can scrunch up my Post-it, toss it away. It's a good dopamine boost. But I find that what I've been doing is, because I travel quite a bit, I will then have Post-its in the places that I'm at, and then they travel with me. And now, like, I have a sleeve of some stuff from our book, but in there are a bunch of Post-its with some to-dos on there that I haven't surfaced, because I'm like, oh, those, whatever, they're fine. But that's where I kind of get lost in my clutter, is like in the to-do list. And then my office gets a little like post-ited.
Great word.
Too much. Yes. And anything can be a verb. But so that's where I kind of get lost in a mess. And so then I have gotten better about like just reviewing them, like, okay, yeah, these are actually done things, so I can throw those away. But that's kind of how it is for me. And it doesn't sound like a very big mess, but it feels like a mental mess, because there's a lot of things written out that I know that I need to do, and are, it doesn't have to live in my mind. It can be on the paper.
Yeah.
But it feels very messy, and sometimes like not sustainable, because I'm like, I can't travel with my Post-its.
For sure.
In
Yeah.
one spot.
But that is tricky though, because you basically have to move your office with you as you're moving around from place to place doing your different roles.
Yeah. And I think, there's a lot of reasons why people have a hard time sustaining a space, or even beginning the decluttering. But it all really comes down to like creating the habit, right? So it's a new habit to have to sustain or maintain a decluttered space. So it's something that we have to work at. It's not just something that's going to automatically happen. And we have to really recognize that and figure out some ways that's going to work. And we'll talk about a few ways to be able to do that in a moment. But how do you feel then when you come back in, say Monday, and your pile of stuff from your classroom is sitting there, but you're like, oh, I need to like weed through this to get to my curriculum stuff? Like, does that cause you some stress or anything? Or
sometimes it depends. Sometimes it becomes a little bit of a blind spot, and I don't see the pile for a few days, and that's okay. But I do share an office. So there is the potential there that I'm adding to that awful clutter stress that some people feel to the other people that I share my office with, which I don't want to do. I don't want to add on anything to anybody else's plate. But just every now and then it does bother me. It does affect me. And that's when I feel like, okay, I'm going to put aside 10 minutes, 5 minutes even before I go home today. And I'm going to do some sifting through this and get rid of stuff that doesn't need to be here, or does this stuff need to be given some feedback and then put in portfolios? What am I actually doing with this work? So I think, Tammy, just listening to this, that we both have the aspiration to sustain these decluttered spaces, but there's for both of us, there is something that's a little bit troubling for us at the moment. So maybe by the end of this recording, maybe for our pair down pointer or something, we can both come up with some sort of action that we want to take in the next little bit to see if that will help us with our decluttered spaces. What do you think?
Yeah, I like that idea. I think you mentioned a couple of really important points on why it's important to keep the spaces maintained. And one of them being like, it does cause a little bit of stress, right? So you come back, because I'm that person where I need to clean up my space before I leave it, because I don't want to come back to the pile or whatever, which, it doesn't always happen. But I think when we can reduce the bit of stress or anxiety around the workplace, it makes us feel better. And then another point you made was like, you're in a shared space. And I think a lot of people can relate to that as well. And so you're recognizing that, I don't want to contribute to someone else's, how they might feel coming into this space. I wonder too how many people are aware of that too, like how their spaces do affect other people that they might share an office with or share a classroom with. Because I mean, I've been in that role too, where had two co-teachers, and both were very organized. So like our systems worked well, but I can't imagine. I think I would have had a great amount of stress had I worked with someone who is not as organized, or just had, like, I don't know. It's not that our classroom was perfectly organized or like decluttered, but we just had systems for everything. And so that reduced the amount of stress I felt with the amount of stuff we had in the room. But working with someone who maybe didn't have some of those structures would cause some angst. And, not just for me, but for anyone, really.
For sure. It reminds me a lot of when we were doing the reading around clutter in preparation for the book. And we found all of that research about how, as you age, especially for women, clutter becomes more and more stressful for you in your life. I found that absolutely fascinating. And I recognize that it's absolutely true for me, because I was one of those teenagers that, like, you couldn't see the floor of my bedroom. That was me when I was a kid. And it didn't bother me. Bothered my mum, but didn't bother me. But now, yeah, that pile on my desk has the potential to bother me now. So I can absolutely identify myself within that research that we were finding out about while we were writing the book. So I think being mindful of that impact, especially when we have, most schools are full of women, if we're adding on to that visual stress for people and overwhelm, we're not helping the culture in our school, are we?
Right. Let's talk about a few tips where we can maybe suggest some ideas for sustaining and maintaining decluttered space. And this might even help even if you haven't started decluttering yet. But, some ideas for, okay, I've cleaned this out, feels good. Now, how do I keep it this way?
Yes, absolutely. Something that has worked for me over the years is, if you keep moving, you have to get rid of stuff. But that's quite an extreme thing to do just to maintain a decluttered space. So what are some more feasible options that we have? I think the first one is creating a schedule or a routine. So at the end of the week or at the end of the month or the end of the semester, whatever it may be, have that habit of, I'm going to do, a day or an hour or a couple of minutes of doing some decluttering and getting rid of some stuff.
Yeah, I think that actual putting the task in your calendar is helpful, because, when we see it in there, we're more likely to do it. And one of the things that I learned from Lavana, who was a guest in our first season, one of the things that she often talks about is like, don't reschedule something more than once. So if it's something that you have, so if you've got like 30 minutes blocked out, Thursday after school, and you're like, ooh, this thing came up, I need to change that to tomorrow or next Thursday, that's the only time you should change it. So, because we know what happens then is that we keep pushing it off and then we never do it. And so we want to make sure that if it comes up, that it has to be changed. And it needs to be one of those things where it's like, okay, something has really come up. Not just like, ooh, I don't feel like doing this today.
Yes.
Like, let's try to get past that, right? Because when we keep doing that, we will never do it. And then we just feel worse. Another thing that might be really helpful is if you have a co-teacher or accountability partner or teacher down the hall, whoever, doesn't matter who it is. If you have someone who's doing the same process, to check in with each other. So you can have someone to bring into this process with you. And maybe they're not even in the same process with you. Maybe they could care less about having a clear space. But as long as you have someone to talk about it with, or, share the importance of why you're doing this, it makes you feel more accountable, and also just we're social people, right? So it's important for us to share the things that we're doing with the people that are in our lives. So if it's important to you, you should share that and bring someone in with you.
Just thinking about the scheduling thing as well, I was reminded of, have you heard of that 5-minute rule for procrastinators? Have you heard of that one?
It sounds familiar, but I don't recall for sure.
So the 5-minute rule is if you're rescheduling something, you're putting it off, you don't want to do it repeatedly, really procrastinating on it. If you tell yourself, I'm just going to do it for 5 minutes. And then once you get to the end of that 5 minutes, a lot of the time you're in it now and you keep going. But if it's so horrible and you're really miserable, you can stop, and at least you feel like you've given it a try. And I have found that really, really helpful when I've been taking on tasks that I don't particularly want to do at that moment. Just say, okay, 5-minute timer, let's go. And it really does help to get you over that hurdle of I don't want to do this, I don't want to do it right now. So that's a good one as well. If you do hit that calendar reminder and you think, oh, I can't imagine anything worse right now, just give it 5 minutes.
I love that. Yeah, that feels so non-threatening.
Yeah, right? You can do anything for 5 minutes. It's fine.
Yes, exactly. Something else I was reading and I found interesting is just keeping some little spaces available in your classroom, office, whatever. And it doesn't have to be like a giant box or anything, but where you have like, oh, this is the little box where I put things that I'm going to give to other teachers or put in the resource room. This is the box where I donate things. So I need to remove this from the school at the end of the week. So having those kind of little deposit areas that are easily accessible, which I think is so great. Like a lot of people at home will have like, this is my Goodwill bag and I'm going to take it to the store to drop off for donation when it's full. I think that's really helpful too, to just maintain your space. Because even when you think about like, I've been thinking about, like getting rid of a lot of the clothes in my closet, and I don't even have that many clothes, but I'm just going through them like, oh, I haven't really worn this. I'm just going to toss it in this pile right now, which, is now a bag, but it just makes it easy for me to then in the moment be like, am I going to wear this? Or I don't like the way this fits anymore or something. I'm going to put it in this bag. It's just so easy. Yeah.
My last few schools, they've done like once a year or twice a year. Do you call them skip bins, or is that just an Australian thing?
Like I think it's Australian.
The giant, big, massive, like industrial size bins.
Like a dumpster. Yeah.
Like a dumpster. Of course. Yeah, that's better. So my last couple of schools, like once a year, they'll have a big dumpster and they'll say, like, if you've got anything to clear out, the dumpster's going to be there on these dates. But I feel like quite often you can get into this mode of like, oh, I've only got 2 days. What am I going to put in the dumpster? So I almost get like a pre-dumpster box. And then I'm like preparing if the next time a dumpster shows up, this is what I'm going to put on there. So that's quite helpful too. And you can have a last check through and make sure you haven't unwisely put anything in there before you get rid of it. But it's helpful to kind of keep that in mind.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. Something that I think might be this tip I think might be a little harder for maybe some people, I don't know. But we've talked about purposeful purchasing before in workshops and webinars and somewhere within the book. And I do this often, but it becomes a process of slowing down what you're doing. And a lot of times we're kind of just in a rush. We run into somewhere, we get what we need and we leave. But if we spend a little time when let's say you need to get some new work clothes or new supplies for school or whatever for work, before you actually put the things in your basket or your cart, really thinking about like, okay, I'm here to get this. So you go to get it and you're like, you're actually evaluating before you put it in your basket or your bin. Some people do that at the checkout, right? Where you put all the stuff in your cart. And then when you get there, you're like, I'm going to put that to the side. I don't need that. I still have some of that. So I've seen people do that. I've done that before, but that just shows like how you're being thoughtful about what you're bringing home, because whatever you're bringing home is going to take up space, or whatever you're bringing back to work is going to take up space, and you have to make sure you have room for it. So with that, if you're bringing something new in, think about removing something before you put something new there.
Or even checking what supplies you do have before putting in the next order, right? So unfortunately, that does happen sometimes when we think, oh, we need some more of craft paper, or we need some more dice, or some more base 10 blocks. And then actually there's another cupboard, in the school somewhere else that has plenty of it that we could have made use of. So I think that's really, really important to make those careful evaluations before we purchase and restock things. It reminds me as well, when we were talking to Dan Tricarico about subtracting. Thank you.
Yes.
And he was talking about the get rid of 10 things a day. Do you remember that conversation? He was saying, like, if you got rid of 10 things out of your house every day, by the end of the week, that's 70 things. It reminds me of that being thoughtful and removing something when you get something new, and all of those good ideas.
Yeah. And it seems, for me, the 10 things a day would sound a little scary.
Okay.
But depends, because I don't have a lot of things in my house either.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you did it for long enough, you'd have nothing left, right?
Yeah, right. So, but if I'm like, okay, I'm going to get a new so I'm going to get rid of this thing to replace it. So I feel like for me, that feels a little more comfortable. And that might be more comfortable for some people too. It's like, so you're replacing the thing that you're bringing in with something new, and you're subtracting one thing, which I think is a fair enough thing to do as well. I think one of the, just kind of thinking about, maybe this is a last tip before pare down pointers, is, and this goes back to like bringing people in when we're going through this kind of process, is to stay inspired while we're trying to stay decluttered, because it can feel like, oh man, I really let this get away from me, and now why should I do it again, because it's just going to get away from me again. But it's really like, this is when I feel like social media can work to our advantage, because you can go onto some like minimalist Instagram reels, or find some good articles that will keep you inspired to remind you why it is important to actually have a space that has not so much stuff in it, because it really does benefit our mental health, our physical health. And it's noticeable when you you do feel physically better when you're like, wow, I just cleaned out a bunch of stuff that just has been taking up all this space for so long, and now I feel really good.
Absolutely. So, yeah. And depending on your personality type, what you enjoy doing, if you love like challenging yourself or reaching a goal, that could be a way to keep yourself inspired as well. I know you've got your 30-day decluttering challenge, don't you, Tammy?
Yes. Yeah. So that was something that I set up for this group of teachers in LA. They were like having these same questions, like, how do we start the process? How do we keep it going? So I'm like, you know what? Here's the 30-day decluttering challenge. And it sounds like, ooh, that's something every day, but they're like very manageable things. So the challenge will be attached in the show notes so people can download that.
Yeah, because I think, as someone who likes to count how many books I read on Goodreads and do things like that, I think like a 30-day challenge would be appealing to me, to kind of, push me over that edge and get a little bit more motivated.
For sure. So this has been a really good conversation. Again, I always love chatting with you about these things.
Absolutely.
Anyway, but do you have a pare down pointer for our listeners for today?
So pare down pointer. I think one of the obstacles that I have, especially at home with decluttering, is I'm often, it's lovely. Your students buy you lots of gifts at the end of the year, or, Christmas or teacher appreciation, things like that. But it's not necessarily things that you would have chosen for yourself. So I have a whole selection of perfumed soaps and candles and lotions and all sorts of things that I don't want to give away, because I feel like I don't want to throw them. Like, they were gifts from my students, I would feel really awful just to throw them away. So one thing that I would really like to start doing is when we have, like, our school is very action oriented, and we are constantly having drives for people less fortunate than ourselves, and they ask for things like dry goods and toiletries and things like that. So I really want to get into the habit of starting to donate some of those gifts that are very thoughtful and kind and appreciated, but are not necessarily something or just too numerous for me to use myself, you know. So I think that's a good habit for me to start getting into, is taking those not necessarily wanted gifts and finding an authentic purpose for them. What about you? What's a good pare down pointer for you?
Oh, that is really, that's a good one. And that's super tricky. And I'm going to kind of cheat here and play my pare down pointer off of yours based on something that we said. So when you were talking earlier about sharing a space and being aware of how your piles might affect someone else, right? Because you're sharing that space. So you just spoke about being the receiver of a gift and, you know, they pile up. But also when we're giving gifts, being very thoughtful about who we're getting something for and why we're getting it. Because, you know, we feel compelled, you know, at Teacher Appreciation, Valentine's Day, all of those things, to gift something to someone without thinking of what they might do with it, right? So I always like gifting a consumable, like here's a coffee card or
a pen,
little thing, right? Something, yes, that's usable, that is eaten, drunk, whatever the one is.
Yes, all of those. Yep.
Yes. And like that makes a difference when you really know someone too, right? So you can get the appropriate gift, or if you know that they're looking for something specifically. And I think that would help reduce the receiver on the other side, some of that stress, like, oh, I love this gift. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, but I don't know what to do with it because this is not something I use all the time. So I think that it comes to like that thoughtful purchasing, in general, right? So not just when we're buying things for ourselves, but also when we're buying things for others. So I'm glad that you brought that point up because that's a real conundrum, right? Like it's like, do I need another coffee mug? I don't know. I love coffee or like tea or whatever. And you can have mugs at school and mugs at home and all of those things. That's fine. But, you know, there are limits to the cupboard space as well. So
this is true. This is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that that's kind of like a two for related pare down pointer. But now, like we had mentioned earlier, that we were going to share the thing that we were going to do to help create that maintenance in our spaces, because we both have things that we do that, you know, kind of hinder us from staying decluttered. So what's your next step going to be to manage your end of day pile?
I think I'm going to merge two, Tammy, with your assistance. Okay. You're involved in this. Sorry about that. So I think what I'm going to do, like I said before, I end up getting this build up of materials because I just want to go home for the weekend. And then when I get back into my curriculum days, there it is waiting for me. So I think what I might do is the start of my curriculum days, the very first thing I do is just take a couple of minutes to do some tidying of that space. I think that's the scheduling part. But then I think I'll also hack into that accountability buddy situation and maybe start sending you a few little pics of my office space. So you can help me out with that one, Tammy.
Yes, for sure. Happy to do that. I'm going to build in pictures as well. So instead of me bringing my Post-its with me and then having this weird assortment of Post-its everywhere, I will take a photo. When I go to travel, I'll just take a picture of the Post-its that I have on my desk and bring that with me. So then I don't have, you know, stuff. And then I'm like, oh, I can't even remember where those Post-its went. Was it that important? And that kind of thing. So I think the picture is a nice way to reduce the amount of, well, the use of Post-its I'm using, because, you know, it can be a lot, but also then a little bit of streamlining, because then I don't have piles of Post-its in multiple places. Thank you so much for this conversation, Christine. I think we talked a lot longer than I thought we were going to on this topic. But I think it's a really important one because I know it's a question that comes up very often from people. And so, any tips that we can give people, I think hopefully will be helpful. So thanks so much for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Some good reminders for me as well. Today's episode was brought to you by Plan Z Professional Learning Services, forward-thinking educator support. Find out more at planzplservices.com.
Be sure to join Tammy and Christine and guests for more episodes of the Minimalist Educator Podcast. They would love to hear about your journey with minimalism. Connect with them at PlanZPLS on Twitter or Instagram. The music for the podcast has been written and performed by Gaia Moretti.